Hi, welcome to another one of Jon Gaunt's podcast where it's John meets interesting people, just people that interest me. I hope they're going to interest you as well. My guest today is somebody I knew years and years ago in Coventry. He was a leading councillor. Then he ran off to Devon and he became an MP. His name's Kevin Foster. He served as Minister of State for Transport, it says here, from September 22 until October 22. That was under Liz Truss. He was also under the Home Secretary Priti Patel, or Dame Priti Patel, as Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Safe and Legal Migration, which is one of the reasons I want to talk to him, from 2019 until September 22. He lost his seat at the general election, which is no surprise, as a load of Tories did. But I'm delighted to say he joins me now from Torbay in Devon. Good afternoon, good morning, Kevin.
Hi, Gaunty. How are you, mate?
I'm all right. It's a long time no see. Tell me then, what's it feel like, first and foremost, to be an MP and then not to be one? Is it like having your legs cut off?
Well, it does feel a bit odd. You go from, loads of emails. And of course, an election campaign, you have about 4 or 5 weeks where, you're up, out, doing stuff every day. To then, next morning, right, what do I do next? And, there's things you have to do, like lay off your staff, which is not a nice thing to do, particularly some of mine were in their early 20s and they have to go off and try and find another job. And then think about what comes next. So you don't lose the passion for issues. I'm still involved in campaigning, still taking interest, but it's in a different way.
Why did you lose?
Oh God, how long you got? Let's go through all the issues in the.
Was it Rishi Sunak? Was it him being the leader?
I think that was part of it. I make no secret. I was no fan. I didn't rate Mr. Sunak, and I don't think he was a leader. He wasn't a particularly, in my dealings with him, particularly effective person to deal with. We can see, I think we had that 18 months under his leadership where I can remember having had issues about people not being able to get an NHS dentist. I've had some people come to see me who, were in pain when they chewed. And, a lot of us were saying, come on, there's issues like this we need to deal with. And we were getting stuff like, well, he's given a speech on AI. Well, fascinating, but that's not really going to change anything. Or
he reminded me a bit of the Gordon Brown situation. I used to always say Gordon Brown was a number 2. He was never I don't mean to be rude. He was never going to be a number 1. And, I had a hole in my underpants. And I felt that about Rishi. I feel that about Starmer. I don't think he's a leader. I think he's there because you lot were so terrible. And also, reform were breathing down your neck. And because there was about 9,000 people voted for reform in your constituency. They were an important player, weren't they?
Yeah, a lot more people voted reform than the Lib Dem majority was in the end. But I think, we got to take it on the chin as the Conservative Party. We can't go off and blame Nigel and blame voters. That's a path. We're on island to nothing if we do that. We need to look at the last Parliament where a lot of colleagues fought and bickered, thought it was all about when their next promotion was coming. And one of the comments I make, when I'm talking to a Conservative audience is some of my colleagues last year left government with surprisingly long names and lists of title when compared to a surprisingly short list of achievements. And that really spoke to what happened in the last Parliament.
But you must have been a bit pissed off because you were having quite a good career. It was going in the right direction. Then, obviously, you served under Liz Truss, served under Priti Patel before her. But then suddenly it crashes and burns because the party is totally out of favour. That must be annoying just on a personal level in terms of career.
Well, it's a little bit annoying. It's more annoying when I see things like, I'm sat in Torbay at the moment, we've now had the hospital rebuild delayed 10 years, a station project axed, and we could spend a lot of time talking about what the current government's doing to the hospitality industry, which is the bread and butter really of Torbay's economy. But I think for me it was more, I was someone who felt we should be part of the team trying to deliver, and I look at a lot of the backstabbing that went on in the back end of Boris, and really the Conservative Party was heading out of government from really the moment we got rid of Boris and really lost our way on a range of issues.
So Starmer didn't win it, you lot lost it.
I think
did we vote for him because he was the least worst of all of you? I don't know.
Yeah, I think, well, you can look at how the vote broke down. You go back to 1997, you look at Tony Blair, 44% of the vote, a clear sense that he should become the prime minister. He came in with quite a plan. He'd done a lot of stuff to prepare people for the fact that, it wasn't all going to be sweetness and light. As he said, he'd stick with spending plans for 2 years. But then you saw things like the minimum wage come in quite quickly, windfall tax. You saw things like the New Deal, as they called it at the time. Whereas Keir Starmer had spent most of the 4 or 5 years, one being capped in hindsight during the pandemic, telling you all what you could, might, or should have done, but no one could remember him telling you to do that at the time. A lot of chintz slogans and pretending that lots of problems would be instantly solved, and he hasn't.
I think the biggest difference between him and Blair was that Blair's got a personality, whether you like him or not, and he's got that magic thing called charisma. And I voted for him the first time he got elected. I often admit it. I didn't the second time, but there was a sense of cool Britannia. It is odd that the Gallaghers are back and Oasis are in the charts and doing these massive concerts, because there was a sense of hope with Blair, which, as you say, he also then did some tough things. Starmer came in and he was like the little grey cloud, wasn't he? Everything was absolute shit, according to him. So it was no uplift at all. And I know Boris used to get slagged off for that, the sunny uplands. But you do need some optimism in a leader, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. I think I wrote about it a couple of months back. One of the biggest mistakes they made was the idea not to hold a budget until the back end of October.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it seemed a great wheeze, the idea that you could put on about the latest date possible to get Rishi Sunak back in the focus, because he would still be responding to it that week, whereas the week later it would be the new Conservative leader, whoever that was. And it must have seemed a great wheeze. But they then spent 4 months telling everyone how terrible it was. Well, of course, people listened, and because they were saying that it's terrible, taxes are going to go up. Well, people with resources, assets, and businesses don't just sit and say, "Oh, that sounds nice." They start moving stuff abroad. They start planning. They start reducing. And of course, because people didn't know what those tax rises would be, they couldn't mitigate against that. And then you had a conference season where Labour should have been in, right, this is what we're doing. We've got a majority. We've got a mandate. We've set out this plan. We've got this legislation going through. These are our priorities in a budget. They actually spent their conference week saying, oh, well, I can't really speculate on what the Chancellors will be putting in her budget, which was a really strange position for a brand new government with a big majority.
But what must have felt odd for you was, here they were, and I think it's a very good explanation of what happened in that first 4 months that you've just given. But you lot couldn't take advantage of it, because we remember your government finishing with like Rishi Sunak getting drowned like a rat outside number 10. I mean, you made so many PR disasters yourselves as a government. And we'll talk in a minute about the fact that, they're constantly using the 14 years of misrule against the Tories, but they had 14 years to get ready. And as you just said, they weren't ready when they came to government. So how annoying was it when you're sitting there and you're thinking, how's this happened? How come we're here? How come he's in charge?
Yeah, as a patriot, at the end of the day, both you and I, we want to see our country go forward and do well. I don't want to be sitting here saying, "Oh, goody, things have gone wrong. I can blame Labour." That's not what I'm about. And you've known me long enough to know. A time when I in Coventry used to work with Labour governments at that times on projects to make the city better. But I just look at it and think, good, how did we end up here? And I can remember some of the predictions during that election campaign. I remember a lady sending me a rude email because I hadn't supported WASPy. And I emailed her back saying, all I'll say to you is, I've been honest. I tell you for free, when Labour's going to be honest at some point if they get into government. And within months, they actually said the honest answer was they were going to do absolutely nothing. Okay. So I think for me, that's where it's difficult. It's difficult to see is that you just see all this going on. You think, oh, come on, and they did have an option. They did have a real mandate last year and they've just squandered it.
Is the financial black hole a load of BS? Or do you reckon that you did leave 28 billion debt or 24 billion, whatever it is? And then add on to that, talk to me about that first budget by Rachel Reeves.
Well, first, I think virtually every seasoned economist says there wasn't the 22 billion black hole that Labour keeps claiming there were. Because, by the way, some of it was public sector spending decisions in terms of pay, that there's probably one of them's now coming back to bite them on the bum quite hard in terms of...
Hang on a minute, though. You lot could have given the doctors a rise and the nurses, and you didn't. Historically, they had fallen well behind. Don't get me wrong, I'm not supporting them on the new strike. I think that's bloody outrageous.
Well, we agreed a deal with nurses, remember, and I think there's plenty of people who've been querying whether the BMA's inflation rate is exactly accurate. But usually when pay rises are handed out with one hand, and let's remember, we actually, not long before the general election, had changed the tax rules around pension because so many NHS doctors were hitting £1 million pension spot. So, let's be clear, this isn't a badly paid role. But to just dish out a 22% pay rise and then not expect people to come back for more was somewhat naive from West Street.
Okay. So the deficit, the black hole, is a bit of a lie, certainly a fib, shall we say, for the moment. But what about the budget? Where did she go wrong there? And is she just no good as a chancellor? I mean, we'll go on to the tiers in a moment, but she doesn't inspire.
No, I think she did. She underestimated the impact of, whilst it was politically convenient to say, rich bosses can pay more national insurance. That seemed all very politically convenient. But of course, the problem is if you tax employers and make job people more expensive to employ, then that means employers stop employing people. Add on the fact that the VAT rise for independent schools, they predicated that on the basis that everyone would still send their kids to a private school. Well, that's clearly not been the case. And also issues in things like the welfare budget, which are there and do need to be tackled. But, she only has to look behind. She doesn't have to look in front of her to see the opposition. It's behind her that's the opposition that's the problem. So the tone was wrong. People had already started to move assets abroad, move activity abroad because of some of the narrative in the lead up to that budget, and then hitting parts of the economy, like, for example, tourism and retail really hard. Business rates up, employers' contributions up, and now we're seeing unemployment going up, the economy slowing down, and of course, that memeans the government's deficit widening.
I want to talk to you about that, about hospitality, because I interviewed somebody who you probably know from Coventry, from Berks Welfare, Nailcott Hall, Rick, yesterday or the day before, and he was saying basically the NI rises and the minimum wage, where Starmer says we've increased the minimum wage. Well, you haven't actually. It's people like me who run a bar or a hotel. And he says it's completely crippling, was his words, the hospitality industry. Now, where you are in Torbay, it must be even worse.
Yeah, we're seeing real hits for businesses here. And what's happening, of course, don't forget to chuck on the fact that the discount on business rates was reduced. So their business rates bills went up as well. So it was sort of a triple whammy. There are businesses that are still doing well, at certain parts of the market, usually at the higher end of the market, where they can put a couple of quid onto a hotel room to mitigate some of those costs. But in the rest of the wider part of the market, there's businesses really struggling. There's pubs still closing. And what's a lot of hotels, particularly family ones, are doing is just not recruiting. So you'll see perhaps the service may not be what you'd expect. But of course, that means then, your young kids looking to get their first job. And let's remember, these are the people being really hit. It's 18, 19, 20-year-olds trying to go into the labour market, trying to get their first job. Where would that have been? The local shop, the local pub, local hotel. They're the ones who are really struggling. And then for the high street, it's been an absolute disaster. You can see more accelerating process of closures, including of banks.
Yeah, Rick was telling me that one of the things the hospitality industry want is a massive reduction in VAT. Is that something that you'd favour?
Well, I'm the sort of person who'd want to see hospitality help. I probably suspect things like business rates, the cost of actually opening your door, which is a sort of block cost, and it's actually a lot of times the thing that pushes individual businesses over the edge, would probably be my first priority around helping out the hospitality sector. Then the NI bills that they're facing, and then potentially after that VAT. So I think that's what I'd like to see happen. But do you know what, Gaunt? Last month, this country borrowed, £20 billion in 1 month? It's only beaten by a month, I think, in the height of the pandemic. I think realistically, we're not going to be seeing tax cuts in the next budget, probably rises and spending cuts, unless the Chancellor's prepared to really make some decisions around the economy and around issues like welfare.
Is she going to survive? Or is he going to throw her under the bus? Because people, and I know somebody knows him personally, somebody who's in the legal profession, and says, look, John, he'd sell his effing grandma if it saved his skin. Now, he might be being rude, I don't know. But Rachel Reeves, she's going under the bus, isn't she?
I think at some point he'll try. I don't see Keir Starmer getting to the end of this parliament as Prime Minister. You look at where Labour is already. I was at Exeter for the county elections. You know, Exeter, pretty solid Labour seat. They've held it consistently since 1997. And we're there watching them get wiped out on the county council. You know, votes going to Reform, going to Greens, you know, even going to the Lib Dems. Labour getting wiped out. It's not going to take many more nights like that for Labour MPs to start thinking about, is Keir Starmer really the person they want to go into the next election with? So we may well see, if pressure comes on him, he tries to stretch Rachel Reeves under the bus. But every decision she's made has been signed off by number 10 and Mr. Starmer. I think she goes under the bus. He'll be pretty quickly following.
What was the crying about?
I think it's hard to know. And, you know,
let me just tell you something, Kevin. You know me, I'm straight talking. I don't buy this bullshit that it was a personal issue, because if it was, we'd have been told by now what the personal issue is. Somebody's covering her back. I reckon he probably told her just before you're off, and that's it. And what about him? He needs to get to Specsavers and get his ears tested as well as his eyes, and maybe Lord Ali will help him. But he's got to get his ears tested. He said he didn't hear her crying. If I was sitting next to you, I'd hear you crying, wouldn't I?
Yeah, I think it was really bizarre, his whole reaction to it. And actually, do you know what? I've got a little bit of sympathy for Rachel Reeves. As Chancellor, she won't be seeing the ONS publication. She'll be seeing week in, week out, what's happening around tax, what's happening around the economy. She'll be talking to the governor of the Bank of England about how bond sales, gilt sales go. You know, the interest rate we're having to pay has been going up. You know, all the Liz Truss collapsed the economy because bond prices went up. Well, bond prices today are higher than they were at any point after the mini budget. So if that was a collapse of the economy, it's happened right now. So I think she's seeing all that. And then she's going into a parliament building where, you know, she's surrounded by people who just seem to think that they can send her a letter and get a tax cut, or they can send her a letter and get spending going up again. Or, you know, couldn't she find some sort of alternative to making changes to the growing welfare bill? You know, we're actually talking cutting the bill. We're talking about mitigating how far it was going to go up. And she couldn't even get that through. And I suspect a lot of that is coming together because she will be, of all Labour MPs and in the government, the most conscious of what will happen if suddenly the bonds can't be sold, if suddenly bond markets give up on the UK being able to pay its debts back. And when that happens, she'll be the one in the spotlight having to announce, you know, the sort of Greek style or Irish style recovery packages, which if people thought George Osborne was tough, wait till you see one of those.
You're listening to the Jon Gaunt Show. I'm talking today to Kevin. Kevin used to be an MP for Torbay. He has served in the government as Under-Secretaries, and we're going to come on to the other issues like migration in a couple of moments and HS2. Stay listening for that. You mentioned Liz Truss. You served under her. Did she get roughly treated? The whole lettuce scenario? You just mentioned the bonds, and you're technically correct, but we all thought she was wrecking the economy.
Well, yeah, you know, bond prices are higher today. Investors have less confidence that Rachel Reeves' budget numbers stack up than they did Liz Truss. That's how you determine whether they do. I think there was a lot in the Conservative Party. And again, coming back to our first conversation about why the Conservative Party lost, there were some who, you know, wouldn't accept the result. They wanted Rishi to get in. They'd wanted to have their next promotion. That's partly why some of them plotted against Boris, was because they're people who'd been outed by him and now were, you know, felt the whole country needed them in office. That she made mistakes. There's no two ways about that. Kwasi Kwarteng was not the right pick. You know, having your mate in, you do need to have someone who's got just that bit of stature, someone who can challenge you. They didn't prepare the ground for it, and they tried to do too much far too quickly. And yeah, we then had what came next.
Should the Tories have never got rid of Boris?
I voted to keep Boris. I think, you know, they say hindsight's 20/20. But Boris is someone that, you know, the country, you know, he's Marmite. There's somebody who really is like him. There's plenty of people who love him. He'd had an agenda. He'd had a vision. And I always sit there thinking, Gaunty, you know, January 2022, when a lot of people wanted to talk about birthday cake and orange juice in the House of Commons, Boris was sat in number 10 with someone saying to him, well, Prime Minister, it's clear Russia's about to attack Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky has thanked everyone for their offers of solidarity, but he wants tools for the fight. Are you prepared to send anti-tank and anti-aircraft weaponry to Ukraine, knowing it will be fired on Russian forces and there'll be no denial. There'll be no, like in the 80s when suddenly Soviet helicopters started disappearing in the skies over Afghanistan. How did that happen? This will be very clear, and he took that decision. That country is still standing because of what Boris did. And I think history will be a little bit kinder to him than perhaps his contemporaries were.
Let's just quickly, and I mean very quickly, talk about Ukraine. Should we still be getting involved? Should we still be funding it? Starmer's very keen on saying the whole of the UK stand with you. Well, I do phone-ins and talk shows. I don't think the whole of the UK are. I think, if anything, we're a little bit Ukraine fatigued out.
Well, I can understand why people would be, because, they see things like water bills going up and other things and think, well, why do we still need to do this? But, let's remember there's a depressing lesson of history that back in the 1930s, there were plenty of arguments about, well, why do we need to build new battleships? We've got, all these people, pressing issues of poverty after the Depression. But we know what came next. And our failure to do things earlier on in the 1930s cost us a massive amount later on. So I think that's the issue with Ukraine is if Vladimir Putin's seen to get a win out of this one, what comes next? What message does that send? And what's the cost of that?
Talking about what comes next, is there any chance that Boris could make a comeback?
Do you know, if it was anyone else going to you and I would probably confidently both say, oh, no, look at all what's happened, this, that, and the other. But, Boris, it's like Lazarus, isn't it? He's had more comebacks than that guy, And I think the only comparator at times is probably the resurrection itself from the Bible in terms of Boris's political career. I think, yes, it is possible. People are looking for a leader. Boris is a leader. Whether you like him or not, you know where he wants to go with things. But I think he would need to think, how would he manage the parliamentary party and how will he deal with issues like, reviving our economy and a stronger position on migration.
But talking about leadership, we're going to migration in a moment. Talking about leadership, let's talk about the Tories then. There's nobody else in the... She's just done this reshuffle yesterday. Cleverly has come in. Is that her star move? I mean, I'm sorry. It's deck chairs on the Titanic time, isn't it? The Conservatives have got no chance of getting re-elected at the moment, whereas somebody like Boris, he's a rock star politician. I don't like everything he does or everything he says, but he would give you that kind of credibility. And I think he's about the only bloke who can communicate as well, if not better, than Nigel Farage, because that's the truth. He's the only communicator now in British politics, isn't he? Nigel.
Well, you're right to say Boris is a communicator, and I think there's an interesting potential that the next general election could easily be Nigel Farage, Angela Rayner, and Boris Johnson vying for the top job. Look, no one's going to be gripped by a shadow cabinet reshuffle. I accept that. No one ran up to me yesterday and said, "Oh, I'm delighted to hear there's a new shadow transport secretary." That just doesn't happen. The core is we are going to need to punch through. Kemi, I think the first few months there were mistakes like the attack on Farage over the Twitter ticker. She needs to reflect on that. She's particularly thinking about confidence and what is going to be different. And we can't just take an 18-month absence. But, I must say I did vote for Rob Jenrick, and that's very well known, my views there.
Yeah, I was going to say, why was there no shuffle for him yesterday?
I think she would have probably been reticent to send a message too much about bringing him up, particularly perhaps realistically. It was only from like deputy leader. And I think Shadow Chancellor was some speculation. I never bought into that because Mel Stride, is your classic out in the media, building up confidence. And actually, the one of few areas where the Conservatives sometimes getting a lead is on economic management. So well done, Mel, with all those media rounds on it. He can go toe-to-toe on numbers. He's a man who understands the city. So I didn't quite believe that sort of speculation, but I think Kemi could have been well advised to put Rob in as a formal deputy leader, because that's one thing I think our party would benefit from having anyway.
Let's talk about migration then. It's the biggest subject of the moment. What do you make of what Labour have done since they've taken office? Because your party wasn't that good at it either. And whilst we're talking about Boris, he did wave in millions as well. So the bottom line is, can we solve the small boat crisis?
Yes, you can. It is possible to solve it. It's not going to be done via, thinking up another great new slogan like stop the boats or smash the gangs. Smash the gangs, a great slogan, not so great strategy. Numbers were reducing through the back end of the Conservative administration, particularly announced things like Rwanda, removal of family union rights. What I think both main parties need to look at is look at what Australia did, which, by the way, is being continued by a Labour government in Australia, not just a
You mean
sort of
throwing the boats
Conservative one.
back and having a real deterrent?
Yeah, it's your third party, changes to Australian law about who could settle. There's a raft of things. So it's not, I always say Australia is a package. It's not just one thing they did and that was how they did it. They did a package. Ditto Greece did something very, very similar and interesting, of course, still within the ECHR and the EU. It's interesting
only
Greece
this
managed.
week, Greece have said, you come to Greece, you're going to get deported or be sent to prison. Would you like to see that kind of action from Britain rather than giving them a 4-star hotel with squeezy soap, as I call it?
Yeah, we're going to need to be tougher. And this is where some of the real debates come in, particularly for a Labour government, that, you are going to need to be prepared to return people, to say, actually, I'm sorry, Matt, I don't believe that you suddenly found God and changed your sexuality when you came from Dunkirk to Dover. That was all very interesting. And be prepared to return. But also you do need a solution, a third country, for countries where realistically you cannot deal with the regime there, or it's a country that refuses to point back. So, for example, we've returned some people voluntarily to Syria. Whether we'd be able to enforce a return to Syria is another matter. Would the government there agree to that?
Well, of course, Labour have been bragging about how many 30,000 returns, but most of those are voluntary returns, aren't they? They're not going into nail bars or going into Deliveroo and pulling people off the bikes and saying, off, go, no?
No, well, some of them will have been immigration enforcement, but small boats, very small numbers. I think they boasted about 3 really big flights and they've gone to Brazil. Well, most people will work out that Brazil isn't a place that we're getting many small boat migrants. But similarly for the Conservative Party, easy to criticise. We need to be coming up with clear plans. And we're certain, I think that will mean looking at our international law obligations, not just the ECHR, and also being clearer where things went wrong around legal migration. And actually, to be fair, the biggest peak of legal migration wasn't actually a Boris wave, it was a Rishi wave, because there had been changes planned by Priti and myself to be brought in the middle to latter part of 2022. I won't bore you with the whole list, that would have dealt with some of the issues that saw migration hit a peak later that year and early next, but they were lost when the government changed.
Why are we putting them in 3-star and 4-star hotels when we could easily use old warehouses, retail parks, army camps? Why can't we put them in army tents? Why can't we do, what we do if there's a flood in Pakistan or an earthquake? Our brilliant troops go in and create tent cities. I'm not talking about treating people inhumanely. Why can't we do that? The moment you say you've got a hotel, you may as well just say, on you come. I mean, look at the hotels in Coventry, the Hill Hotel, the hotel in Daventry. My sister got married in one of those hotels, a beautiful, beautiful hotel, and it's been full of migrants. People are making loads of money off the back of this, and some of them are Conservative donors, of course, and Conservative supporters, and just like Deliveroo, and today, Starmer, tear a tissue. He's going to get tough on those companies and those illegals. They've been doing it for bloody years. Has he not got any eyes? Have none of you politicians? Do you not see what's happening around you?
Well, certainly we certainly see. I can remember we were discussing nail bars and various enforcement. Yeah. But you're right, Gaunt, about, we do need to move away from using hotels. The reason they ended up being used is you've got a legal duty on one side and a lack of housing on the other. The most extraordinary comment of this week was Keir Starmer's idea that some councils with loads of housing available. Well, at the same time as Angela Rayner's telling councils they need to build loads of new houses because there isn't much. Well,
why did he say that? And was it a lie? Was it a blatant lie, that?
Well, I think he was talking absolute nonsense. He just literally, was he lying directly? Possibly. But what he actually said, I think it just struck me as a line that someone had given him, that, there's this sort of cheap housing we could rent out. But here's the real kicker on that one, Gaunty. You've got a lot of people in London, the South East, asylum seekers being housed in hotels and up into the Midlands, you've just touched on. But if I'm guessing where he's referring to, we're talking about rented accommodation in parts of the north and perhaps the top bit of the Midlands as well. So, we could see quite a big move of people from hotels in the south into parts of the Red Wall. Now, I can't imagine many newly elected Labour MPs from last year are going to find their constituents particularly grateful for that shift into their communities. Plus, that'll create real housing pressures locally as well.
Well, it's already beginning to happen, and that's part of the contract, isn't it? He's going to just say we've reduced the hotel bills, but all he's done is put them into houses of multiple occupancy. And personally, if my daughters were still younger, I'd rather them be in a hotel than dangerous.
You know where they are, yeah.
rather than in a house in our road. And of course, it reminds me back ages because we go to the protest now. When I was working on The Sun, the editor of The Sun had this campaign, and she called it Sarah's Law. And it was Portsmouth or Plymouth, I can't remember which city it was, where they dumped all the paedophiles basically on a white working class estate. And the women of that estate, very like these things that have been happening in Epping and now out in Norfolk, they said, no, enough's enough. We want to know where they are. So she had this idea you had a right to know where a paedophile was living. And you probably remember the big controversial thing that happened. A paediatrician got their house burnt down, and I think they might have even got murdered because of it. Terrible and wrong, etc., etc. But I remember a news night I went on, and they were talking about these women, and all they could concentrate on, the BBC was that they all had white heels, miniskirts, and they were out at 10 o'clock at night protesting, and they had their children with them. Well, of course they did, because they haven't got bloody nannies or whatever else. It was this total snobby attitude. If we just dump them on the working class, we'll get away with it. And I see echoes of that now.
There's certainly echoes of it, John. And you've not you saw there was that clip yesterday, and I won't repeat the language in it, but it almost perhaps summed up Labour's dilemma. You had quite middle class in appearance protester who turned up to say that we should all be very welcoming to refugees and we should be helping them. And, no concept that, well, where, how many, this, that, and the other. And then suddenly a guy cuts in shouting, well, what about I'll sum it up, what about our community? What about us? What about our community? And you can see this is perhaps the dilemma for Labour. The person doing the protest in favour of asylum seekers is probably the sort of person who goes on to become a Labour MP. Whereas the person shouting is the sort of person who's actually been the bedrock of Labour's vote over the decade, i.e. the communities where many of these people then end up being placed. And there has been quite a dismissive attitude. We've seen that with the grooming gangs, where much of mainstream media just didn't really want to know and tried to ignore it, and actually ran stories about basically, if you imply, let's say we'd had this discussion 5 or 6 years ago, it didn't mean, me and you, we're racist and all prejudice and that. Yeah. Actually, it was going on. They just ignored it.
And ordinary people have woken up to that now, haven't they? Which is perhaps explained, coupled with these brilliant communication techniques, why Nigel Farage is going to end up being the next Prime Minister, because he's tapped right into it. And of course, the same thing's being accused of being a racist, etc., etc. But he's unstoppable now, isn't he? Hasn't he got the agenda?
Well, first, I wouldn't assume it's inevitable Nigel Farage will become Prime Minister, because whilst people point reforms so many votes ahead and this, that and the other, they're polling usually about 29-30%. That leaves reform very vulnerable to tactical voting, particularly by more left-wing inclined voters who may very well, the one thing they don't want will be potentially a Nigel Farage government. So, we do need to just add that really big caveat. But yeah, both people are frustrated. They're looking around for, well, who's got an answer? Who's got a solution? And, they'll say, well, Labour said they had, and they hadn't got it. Rishi Sunak said he's going to stop the votes and didn't. So it's no surprise they're then looking at another party and another person. So that's going to be the challenge for the particular two major parties, traditionally major parties. How do you respond? How do you give real answers to people? And then don't attack the man. There's no point slagging off Nigel Farage personally. But then how can you say, well, look, here's how we've got a proper plan that we could actually deliver. And then say, and Nigel, he's got some great slogans, he's got some great columns. But when you start picking apart some of these plans, quite quickly, some of the answers start falling apart.
What do you think about what he said about crime and punishment, law and order, talking about deporting foreign criminals, talking about putting serious criminals abroad? This echoes well with the audience that he's trying to attract, doesn't it?
Yeah. It echoes well. Although when you start asking questions like, well, how are you going to pay for this? How will it pay for itself? Well, if only that was the case. I was in the Home Office, we did policing policies. I wish they did just pay for themselves. They don't. That's an unrealistic position to take. But some of it, actually, cutting away at some of what he said, actually, there is a good argument that we could look at renting cells overseas, particularly if it involves foreign nationals from the country concerned or from a neighbouring country. People talk about the El Salvador one's the one that's come up. Well, there are people in our prisons who come from countries in the Americas who we would be looking to deport back to those countries at the end of their sentence. It's not something that we should just dismiss out of hand. Denmark, I think it is, has rented cells in another part of Europe. So let's not just dismiss it out of hand merely because it's said by Nigel Farage. But I think it's when you get into some of the details. And actually, he's going to deport people. Okay, there's countries that say now, hey, we'll get a bilateral agreement. Well, that's easy said, hard done.
Okay. What about the agreements that Starmer's put in place? America, the trade deals. Has he not done some good in this last 12 months?
Well, look, I'm not going to just critique everything that he's done in the last 12 months. If we're getting agreements, particularly with partners like the USA, then that's welcome. Although I think we should perhaps not celebrate too much when we look at what our trading position was a year or two ago with the US on some of those areas. But Keir's got some real decisions to make, particularly around things like energy costs. A lot of what Ed Miliband's coming out with is all very well, but it isn't particularly realistic. Saying we want to save the steel industry, but then veto plans for a mine in West Cumbria to produce metallurgic coal, which is absolutely vital to producing virgin steel. So it's not all bad. There's areas that, I would congratulate some of what the government's done, but that doesn't mean that we can't then rightly scrutinise other parts. Okay,
the green energy then. Would you scrap the zero targets that they're after?
Yeah, I'd make it. I think a lot of the targets they're aiming for are just unrealistic. Particularly, and this is again the challenge for Labour, is a lot of their more middle-class supporters who become Labour MPs really, really value some of that stuff. And what's a couple of grand for a boiler, or I'm buying a new car, just get an electric one. Yeah, you and I know, let's say we were, still in your old Cobb days, you and I take a walk around Willenhall or Wood End, places that have been bedrocks of support for the Labour Party in Coventry for decades. And they'll we say that sort of stuff. They look at us like we've gone out, and rightly so. So I think that's where some of these targets are going to hit some of the poorest, the hardest, and that's really something that we just can't accept. Even though a more wind power of stuff's fine, but we do need to look at domestic sources of oil and gas and get on with building nuclear.
Yeah, you're watching the Jon Gaunt Show. We're going to finish in a moment. Just before we do go, don't forget you can send comments in on my YouTube channel. Feel free to do that afterwards when you've watched this. But let me just ask you a question about HS2. Again, another massive subject, in particularly in the Midlands and in the North. Isn't it time just to cut our losses?
Well, it'd be very tempting. So I think we're now so far gone with it that we do need to complete it and get something out of the money that's gone in. But it's been a textbook of how not to manage a project. The initial idea was to create extra capacity on the West Coast Main Line. Well, a lot of that could have been done by reinstating the old Great Central Railway that was lost in the 1960s. But no, we were going to have something brand new. Don't build yesterday's railway. Let's travel at 250 miles an hour. Great. Okay. Well, that added a huge cost to it. We've had a lot of stuff along the route about impact. Well, I think you'll only see it open countryside for about like 10 minutes on a 50-minute journey. So, we've got to make a decision in this country, Gaunt, about do we want to build infrastructure like that? If we do, how do we do it effectively and more rapidly? I think if we went back 10 years ago now, you wouldn't approve this project.
No, but I spent the best part of 25, 30 years commuting to London, none of which we have to do now. I'm in my spare bedroom. You're at home at the moment. The quality is good enough for everybody. This whole idea, and it's the same with loads of industries. By the time you got on the train, had a cup of coffee, got your laptop out, you're at Euston. Well, that's what I feel anyway. Just before you go, Starmer's gone on holiday and he's warned the cabinet that he thinks there could be riots again. It is the anniversary of Southport next Tuesday, I believe it is. Do you think there's going to be real riots on the streets?
Well, first,
around the hotels,
First, Gordon, I'll always caveat this with, I hope not, you don't make a point about a considered point about migration policy or thoughts on the government by throwing bottles at the police. And the police officers who do a brave and difficult job, cannot become society's punch bags when things go wrong on both sides of political opinion. But it's clear there is a lot of dissatisfaction out there. And that's simply what Angela Rayner apparently said to the cabinet this week, that, there are some simmering issues there around housing, around opportunities, around regeneration that our governments need to engage with and deal with, not just pretend they don't exist or accuse everyone who says something about integration of being racist, just they can't think of a better answer, or far right. And particularly also the impressions of two-tier justice as well. What Lucy Connolly said was wrong. I'm not going to defend it. But really, still in prison for it? No. And I think there could be disturbances. I hope not, but I really think the government does need to engage with some of these issues, particularly around communities that feel very left behind.
And of course, this story now that in Epping, in Essex, the police actually brought the left-wing protesters almost under police guard to face off the the alleged far right. That just can't happen. We can't have two-tier policing and two-tier justice, can we? Because that will end in a kind of civil war if we're not careful.
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-blowing. It'd be a bit like saying, there's a tense situation outside an Arsenal game. I know, let's bus in 50 Spurs fans and see how they all get on together. It was just mind-blowing that was deemed to be, and I think there needs to be a serious inquiry into who thought that was a good idea. And it was wrong. And what are the police doing? Bussing protesters anyway. You should be starting public order, but you're not there to drive people around like a taxi service.
Whoever made that decision's got to be sacked, in my opinion. They can't continue in that role because they've stopped being a police officer, whoever it was, police chief constable, if it is the chief constable, and you've become a social worker. And I'm sorry, that's not your job. Or you've become a campaigner yourself. You cannot do that.
No, I completely agree. It made a difficult situation a lot worse. What on earth was going through that person's mind? And it really says that their judgment is extremely poor. If they thought the same, as I said, it'd be in the football world, it'd be like, bussing in opposing fans to a tense situation involving a home crowd. You just wouldn't do it. So I just think that's certainly something to be looked at. And we do need to say though that whatever people feel, the police can't become punch bags, chucking bottles around, smashing up your local community. That isn't a way to send a message about your dissatisfaction with Keir Starmer's government. Okay,
look, it's been great talking to you again after all this time. But just before you go, do you still support Coventry City?
Yeah, I've still got a bit of. We were up there in December. Great to see it's great to see where the club's gone under Doug King. It's heartbreaking to see what happened, particularly back in the season. Playing in Birmingham for goodness' sake. So wish them all the best. I must say, living in Torquay, I do go along to Torquay United a bit. They're having their own revival, and hopefully under the new management, it's got so many similarities to what Doug's done in Coventry. And the only thing that's missing is the much earned and well-deserved promotion that I hope will come this season for Cov back to the Premiership.
Well, we'll see about that. And the Lionesses, they won, of course.
Well, brilliant. What a goal. What a time to score it as well last night. And then the penalty save. But I was watching as it lined up. I thought, the goalkeeper's good. I hope at least one of the team is the moment she touches that ball running in. And they were. You had the two of them there and bam in. What a great moment. And, the manager, I think this is now her 5th consecutive major tournament final. All I can say is when you finish this tournament, Sabrina, perhaps there might be a job with the men's team coming up at some point.
Do you know what? I'm in a terrible position because I slagged it off. I said, look, it doesn't need to be on the telly. It's good. I understand the sexism behind why women's football got banned and therefore it hasn't progressed, etc., etc. But it's not elite sport. It's not a great watch. Can we stop bullshitting about it? It isn't great, I said on Twitter. 80,000 people supported or against me. And then, of course, last night, I'm home alone. I watched the second half. I watched the penalty, as you say, and I was enthralled. It was brilliant. It was proper sport because you didn't know what was going to happen. There was highs, there were lows. And what I like most, and I've got to say this, and I'm going to apologise to all my fans later, that I actually thought the women played with a real spirit that we could do within our male team as well. You know, they weren't going to give up when they were like a few minutes away from losing. They were still playing. I thought it was brilliant, and it's got to be down to the manager mainly. You're right.
Yeah, fantastic, great team spirit. And what was a nice thing, and you may have noticed as well, also about the spirit in between the teams as well. Yeah. Our match winner had swapped shirts with an Italian at the end of the match, and I thought that's quite, you know, a sign of respect between the two teams as well. You know, memorable of some of the great performances from past England teams. So no, it was great, Matt. It was enthralling. It's exactly what we want from a big contest like that, and kept going right the way up to the last minute, and thankfully went England's way.
I'm even going to go to the pub and watch the final, which is amazing because I was giving it room space before. Kevin, great. Thank you for joining me. Stay there for a moment. I'll come back to you in a second to say goodbye to you, but thank you for joining us today. That's Kevin Foster. What did you make of him? He's had some great roles in government. I think he will get back into politics. I should have asked him, are you going to join Reform? Because that's the only way he's ever going to get power. But anyway, that's a separate issue. You've been listening to the Jon Gaunt podcast. If you like it, please share it, retweet it, press the like button. And if you want to donate to help me out, it's www.buymeacoffee.com, or click on the little padlock on the YouTube video. And if you want to keep up to date with what I'm doing, subscribe to Jon Gaunt TV on YouTube. It doesn't cost anything. It's completely free. But thanks for watching today. I enjoyed that. I'm enjoying this, just talking to people who I find interesting. There'll be another one soon. But don't forget, I'm back every night, Monday to Thursday at 6:30 for the ranting show. So join me there. Until then, if you've got kids, give them a kiss, give them a hug. Hey, hey, hey. Don't forget to tell them you love them. See ya.